Hello, everybody, and welcome to a class in cerebral blood flow. I am Dr. Sharath Krishnaswami, and I am a neuroanesthetist and a neurocritical care physician. So, cerebral blood flow is of vital importance to neurologists, neurosurgeons, neuroanesthetists, as well as internal medicine candidates. So, anybody who begins to treat the brain or conditions of the brain or pathologies or emergencies of the brain, this is very helpful for them so that they can develop their skill set in dealing with such patients. So why is the brain very important? Because it has a high metabolic rate, and the oxygen demand of the brain is more when it compares to the brain as compared to all of the other organs. And it contains just 2% of the body mass, but it receives 20% of the oxygen consumption and 15% of the resting cardiac output. That is about 700 ml per minute in the adult. So the blood flow in the brain uh, is varying between the gray matter and the white matter. The gray matter uh, needs about 70 ml of blood per 100 grams per minute, whereas the white matter needs about 20 ml per 100 grams per minute. And taking the average of these both, you can get the mean resting cerebral blood flow of about 50 ml per 100 gram of brain tissue per minute. Now, the broad division of the arterial system of the brain can be divided into the anterior circulation and the posterior circulation. So, the anterior circulation is fed by the internal carotid artery, and the posterior circulation is supplied by the vertebral arteries and is known as a vertebro-basilar circulation. So, the pathways are embedded in this system known as the Circle of Willis. So this is basically a hexagonal ring of vessels which lies in the subarachnoid space, and it encircles the pituitary gland. And this is important because it indicates that there will be collateral circulation in case there is a block in any of the arteries of the Circle of Willis. So routes of the collateral circulation are the anterior communicating artery here, the posterior communicating arteries here, and the ophthalmic artery via the external carotid artery. So there can also be to and fro movements of the blood in the Circle of Willis, and it maintains the patency and it prevents thrombosis and atresia. So it also allows the flow when you have a pressure differential. Coming to the internal carotid artery. So as I said, the anterior circulation is supplied with internal carotid artery, and there are two methods of classification of the internal carotid artery. That is the terminologica anatomica and the Boutellier classification. The terminologica anatomica is simply divides the internal carotid artery into the cervical, petrous, cavernous, and the cerebral parts. Whereas the Boutellier classification, which is used by neurosurgeons, neuroradiologists, and neurologists, can be divided into 7 parts. That is the cervical, which is basically the artery in the neck, which extends from the bifurcation of the carotid into the external carotid artery and the internal carotid artery. And then the C2 is the petrous part, where the artery lies in the temporal bone. And C3 is the lacerum part, where the artery begins above the foramen lacerum and ends at the petrolingual ligament. The C4 part is a cavernous part. Here, the artery is surrounded by the cavernous sinus, and it is situated between the layers of the dura mater, which forms the cavernous sinus. After this, the artery becomes intradural, and it is known as the clinoid part, which is known as C5. And this is when it enters into the subarachnoid space. Once it enters into the subarachnoid space, it gives off the ophthalmic artery, and it runs till the origin of the posterior communicating artery. The C7 is the posterior communicating artery. The terminal branches of the internal carotid artery are the anterior and the middle cerebral arteries, which I shall show you in the coming slides. So the neuroradiologists have understood the classification of the internal carotid artery using this, the C1, C2, C3, C4, C5, which is the clinoid part, ophthalmic part, and the communicating branch. Coming to the first aspect of the anterior circulation, that is the anterior cerebral artery. So this passes over the optic nerve and it connects with the vessel of the opposite side by the anterior communicating artery. So if you can see here, the anterior cerebral artery originates here and it divides into the callosomarginal artery and the pericallosal artery. The ACA, that is the anterior cerebral artery, is divided into the 5 segments, but the ones that we will be concerned with are the A2, the A1, A2, and the A3. The A1, it extends from the internal carotid artery to the anterior communicating artery. A2 extends from the anterior communicating artery to the bifurcation of the pericallosal artery and the callosomarginal arteries. And A3 is the pericallosal artery, which is the main terminal branch. A4 and A5 are the smaller branches. Coming to the middle cerebral artery. The middle cerebral artery, as I have mentioned before, it arises from the internal carotid artery and continues into the lateral sulcus. This here is the lateral sulcus. It branches and projects to many parts of the lateral cerebral cortex. And it also supplies blood to the anterior temporal lobes and the insular cortices. Now, I put this diagram to explain to you the different parts of the brain using the skull, which is an axial section of the skull. So the blue here is a frontal bone. In between the wings of the blue of the frontal bone is the ethmoid bone. The bat-shaped appearance behind the frontal bone in yellow is a sphenoid. Beside the sphenoid on either side is the temporal. And above the temporal, you can see in green is the parietal. And behind the red, that is the temporal, is the occipital. Now, the middle cerebral artery is of great importance to all of us because, as you know, the area supplied by the middle cerebral artery, when there is a thrombosis or an infarct, can lead to paralysis, semiparesis, and other conditions. So, as I told you, the sphenoidal segment of the brain, M1 is the sphenoidal segment of the middle cerebral artery, which I had just told you. And M2 is when the middle cerebral artery goes inward into the insular cortex, and hence it is known as the insular segment. Now, M3 is when it goes along the operculum. So the operculum is basically a lid which is a fold in the temporal lobe, and the middle cerebral artery supplies this region known as M3. And M4 is the terminal or the cortical segments which irrigates the cortex. This is a coronal section of the brain. If you can see, the middle cerebral artery bifurcates into the superior division and the inferior division. And these are the various branches of the middle cerebral artery, which supply the putamen, the internal capsule, the caudate nucleus, and the lateral ventricle. Now, there is the anterior communicating artery and the posterior communicating artery. So as I mentioned before, the anterior cerebral artery, which arises from the internal carotid artery, goes towards the frontal lobe, and in that process, there is a bridging between the anterior between the anterior cerebral artery, which is known as the anterior communicating artery. So this is approximately 4 millimeters in length, and it separates the A1 and the A2 segments of the anterior cerebral artery. Now, the PCOM, which is known as a posterior communicating artery, arises from the internal carotid artery, and it anastomoses with the posterior cerebral arteries on each side, and this completes the Circle of Willis. Moving on to the posterior cerebral artery. This diagram is just to explain and describe the path of the posterior cerebral artery. If you can look here, it also supplies the posterior part of the brainstem, and in the diagram, what is highlighted in red is the area supplied by the posterior cerebral artery. Now, moving on to understand the supply of the brain from the posterior side, the two vertebral arteries join together to form the basilar artery. The basilar artery then bifurcates into the posterior cerebral artery, and the posterior cerebral artery can be divided into three parts. That is the P1, the P2, and the P3 in this diagram. So what you see over here is the P1 segment of the PCA. What is mentioned as 6 is the P2 segment of the PCA, and P3 segment of the PCA is labeled as 7. Now, how is the posterior part of the brain supplied with blood? This is through the posterior circulation, which begins with the vertebral arteries. And the vertebral arteries are nothing but branches of the subclavian artery. So this artery ascends to the transverse foramina of the atlas, and it perforates the dura mater and the arachnoid mater of the meninges. And then it passes through the foramen magnum, and straighter it moves on to the anterolateral aspect of the medulla. So this unites the caudal border of the pons to form the basilar artery, and it forms the vertebro-basilar arterial system. Now, coming to the branches of the vertebral artery, you can find here, as it is described as V1, V2, V3, and V4. V1 is a preforaminal part. V2 is a foraminal part, which it goes through the foramen. And then when it comes to the C2 vertebra, up to the dura, it is known as the V3 segment of the vertebral artery. And V4 is nothing but the intradural part of the vertebral artery. The interdural part gives rise to the anterior and the posterior spinal arteries. Now, as I said before, the two vertebral arteries unite to form the basilar artery. Now, where is this located? This basilar artery, it goes in the central grooves of the pons, and it is placed within the pontine cistern. In the upper border of the pons, it bifurcates into the posterior cerebral arteries. And it also gives rise to the anterior inferior cerebral artery and the superior cerebellar artery. Coming to the different parts of the posterior cerebral artery, the posterior cerebral artery is the terminal branch of the basilar artery, and it can be divided into 4 parts, that is the P1, P2, P3, and P4. So the P1 is the termination of the basilar artery to the posterior communicating artery. This is present within the interpeduncular system. P2 is from the posterior communicating artery that is around the midbrain. And what are the parts of it that is around the midbrain that can be divided into the pre-communicating and the post-communicating. The pre-communicating segment is also known as the crural part, and the post-communicating can be described as the ambient part. So that is when it is in next to the crural cistern and the ambient cistern. And P3 segment is when it is placed inside the pudicigeminal cistern. P4 can be described as the cortical segments. So this is another diagram describing the length and the extent of the posterior cerebral artery, as well as its various branches. Now, coming to which areas of the brain are supplied by these arteries. So the cortical vascular territories are supplied by the 3 major arteries. For example, in the first image on the left, you can see that the frontal and little bit of the parietal area are supplied by the anterior cerebral artery described in yellow. And the middle cerebral artery supplies major of the temporal part, little bit of the parietal, and it is described in red. And towards the posterior side, you can see the posterior cerebral artery described in blue. When it comes to the cortical vascular territories of the medial side of the brain, the major aspect of the brain is supplied with the anterior cerebral artery. And if you can see posteriorly, the blue is supplied by the posterior cerebral artery. Coming to the coronal section of the brain, you can see that the medial aspect of the lobes is supplied by the anterior cerebral artery. The yellow, which is major part, is supplied by the superior and inferior divisions of the middle cerebral arteries. And this portion here in red is supplied by the posterior cerebral artery. This is another axial section of the brain showing the supply of the various parts of the brain by the cerebral arteries. And as you can see, the yellow forms a major part of it, which is applied with a middle cerebral artery, and ACA in blue in between both the hemispheres anteriorly, as well as the posterior cerebral artery behind, supplying in the area in between both the hemispheres. So this is all for now. I shall come back and explain the different aspects of cerebral circulation and its implications for us clinicians in the neurocritical care ICU. Thank you.